Hey, what's up guys? Bowblax here, and we're back for another episode of Twitterverses. Today we're going to be talking about well-respected debater, influencer, now banned Twitch streamer, and fellow cuties lover, Mr. Girl.
Oh hell no! We ain't doing no beta Twitterverses around here, boys. This is Twitterverses but for Chads and Alphas.
So Bowblax?
I'm your daddy now.
Let's get into it.
Bowblax got BTFO'd and exposed as a degenerate on Twitter the other day. Ricky Berwick tweeted at Bowblax, nice search history. Cuties and Ariana Grande at 16? Are you serious, my dude? This led to thousands of likes and reactions from people absolutely destroying him.
I replied, Bowblax's explanation. I was curious after my discussion with Mr. Girl, so I looked it up to see if I would be attracted to it, and I wasn't, lol. See, I looked up Ariana Grande now to compare. Max Carson replied, Mr. Girl made me do... Wait a second. I know this dude did not just reply to me.
Mr. Girl and Bowblax have gotten to a bit of a squabble recently, and I'm going to get into exactly what they have been talking about later, but I think it's necessary that someone does a bit of a deep dive into the cracks of Mr. Girl's logic, and specifically how they've seemed to come out with his discussion with Bowblax and Augie. So yes, that's what today's video is going to be about.
For those of you who don't know who Mr. Girl is, he's recently been gaining a lot of attention in the online debate sphere. He argues many topics, but certainly his most controversial and popular topic is pedophilia and the concept of thought crimes. He recently had a debate on Augie RFC's channel, which I will link in the description. A basic summary of his stance is, no thought is bad, because no thought can harm anybody. You can think about anything, whether that be killing people, sexually assaulting people, stealing things from a store, or yes, even doing inappropriate things to children. If you're really curious to hear more about his stance and arguments, I'd suggest watching the debate. To a normal person, that argument summary I just provided might be gross, but logically correct. Yes, technically speaking, an actual thought doesn't harm anyone, no matter how disgusting it may be. But the problem lies in the extent of these thoughts and your natural reaction to them. Mr. Girl gives an example to this in his last interview he did with Augie just yesterday. Now, this might make you a bit uncomfortable, but let's just listen to the clip.
Probably everybody has had a sexual thought about... Also, I'll also say my definition of sexual thought is probably pretty broad. But I'm saying like a brief admiring glance, you know, like a 11-year-old in a swimsuit or something. If that happens once in your life, does that make you a pedophile? I would say no.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's makes sense.
I
as a
think
definition.
most people would, if this thought entered their head, they'd be like, no, and they immediately think about something else.
Yeah, for sure. Which is, I would say, a pretty normal reaction to that.
So immediately, let's get into some definitions, because we need to break down exactly why Mr. Girl's logic fails. At the beginning of this clip, it seems to be that Augie and Mr. Girl are talking about intrusive thoughts. What is an intrusive thought? According to an article medically reviewed by Timothy J. Legg, a geriatric and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner and also a licensed psychologist, intrusive thoughts are sudden and voluntary thoughts that can be disturbing. These thoughts can be distressing for the individual, and they do not lead to harmful action. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, intrusive thoughts are involuntary and have no bearing on reality or a person's desires. People do not act on these thoughts, typically finding them shocking and unacceptable.
Now let's watch another part of the clip.
The framing that, like, I think some thoughts are good and some thoughts are bad. And so I want to take thoughts about children and move them from bad to good seems to be like the main criticism about that review.
That's
not
what
what
people are worried about.
Absolutely. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I want to take thoughts that are bad and kind of relabel that as thoughts that would be bad if you acted on them. But that doesn't mean the thoughts have to be bad. You don't have to hate yourself for every sexual fantasy you have. That's something you wouldn't do.
The problem with Mr. Girl's logic is that he seems to confuse unwanted intrusive thoughts with fantasy. The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines fantasy as any of a range of mental experiences and processes marked by vivid imagery, intensity of emotion, and relaxation or absence of logic. Fantasizing is normal and common and often serves a healthy purpose of releasing tension, giving pleasure and amusement, or stimulating creativity. It can also be indicative of pathology, as in delusional thinking or significant disconnection from reality. This definition, along with multiple other definitions of fantasy, according to psychologists, seem to define a positive thought which stems from a desire or a thought that grants pleasure, amusement, or positive stimulations in the brain. Unwanted intrusive thoughts are not fantasies. Just because it is a thought in your head doesn't mean it's the same thing psychologically as a fantasy. And you cannot compare people having unwanted intrusive thoughts about children to people who fantasize about them. Another strange contradiction that Mr. Girl has in his logic is an article he referenced in his debate with Augie RFC. The main premise of this failure in logic is this point right here. Less than half, around 40%, of sexual assaults against children are committed by pedophiles. The majority of sexual crimes against children are perpetuated by people who do not have a history of disordered sexual arousal to children. Instead, issues of drugs, alcohol, anger, isolation, and control motivate these tragic events. This is essentially saying that a majority of the problem regarding sexual assaults to children are not actually pedophiles, but rather people who have these other factors, such as being under the influence, such as being angry, such as desiring control, being isolated, not having a proper social understanding of consequence, etc. They're not people who actually have sexual desires towards children. Basically listing these things as potential risk factors which can lead to sexual assaults against children. Now, it seems to be that one of Mr. Girl's main points is that no thought is bad, and when one compares thoughts to real-world actions, that it is oppressive and constraining. Let's watch this clip.
I don't think a thought that if you acted on would be bad is a bad thought. Just the entire framing of thoughts are precursors or potential actions, and we should judge them based on what would happen if you acted on them. I don't agree. Like,
however, in this next clip, he seems to completely contradict himself.
the same way if somebody said, like, you know, I like gore, I'm obsessed with gore, I'm obsessed with serial killers, I blah 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 blah, and then they're like, hey, do you want to go camping? I probably would say no.
Just so I understand your thought process, and your hypothetical you brought up about like the camping with the person who loves watching gore.
Yeah.
What about that person would make you not want to go camping with them, or would make you double think about going on a trip with them? Like, why would you not want to do that?
Knowing that they're probably fantasizing about gutting me to an extent that is far beyond the normal person. So I think anytime, like if you're going hunting or at a shooting range, everyone is constantly thinking like, well, I could just blow everybody's head off. I mean, that, to me, that's a normal thing to be thinking if you have a gun in your hand. Is like, well, I could shoot myself. I could shoot the wall. I could shoot the window. I could shoot the camera. I could shoot whatever. And like your brain's constantly thinking about all the stuff you could shoot. But that's different from like, no, like I really could do this. And I feel like if somebody is like really preoccupied with like stabbing and murdering people, then it would start to get into that territory.
But it's all in their head though, right? Like what's the, it's just something they like thinking about, not doing.
It's something that, okay, if you're having a fantasy and you are unbothered by it and you enjoy it and you're indulging in it, it is something you would like to do. Either some part of you would like to do it or a lot of you would like to do it. So I'm not saying that thoughts can't lead to actions. I get what you're saying. The more preoccupied you are with doing something bad, that is one predictor that you will do it. You have a reason to do it now. I think the problem on the internet is that we've removed most of the other restraints.
Mr. Girl says, quote, "The more preoccupied you are with doing something bad, that is one predictor that you will do it." This is directly saying that pedophilic thoughts are a risk factor which could lead to children being abused. And this is why some thoughts are bad, because they are a predictor which can lead to real world harm. And especially the more preoccupied you are with doing something to children, the higher the risk is. especially if these preoccupations are not met with an initial feeling of disgust. Another argument he makes is that you can have these thoughts and fantasies and know that you will not do them, and that that's okay, because everyone thinks about things that they know they won't do, and it doesn't matter what that is. Well, this is wrong psychologically as well, because in that same article I linked earlier, speaking about intrusive thoughts, it says this: in reality, a thought, even a very scary thought, is not an impulse. The problem is not one of impulse control, it is over control. They are at opposite ends of the continuum. However, sufferers get bluffed by their anxiety and become desperate for reassurance. However, reassurance only works temporarily, and people can become reassurance junkies. The only way to effectively deal with intrusive obsessive thoughts is by reducing one's sensitivity to them, not by reassurance that it won't happen or that it's not true. Unwanted intrusive thoughts are reinforced by getting entangled with them, worrying about them, struggling against them, and trying to reason them away. They are also made stronger by trying to avoid them. Leave the thoughts alone, treat them as if they are not even interesting, and they will eventually fade into the background. The way Mr. Girl presents himself is wrong, according to this article. He reassures the people with these unwanted intrusive thoughts that it won't really happen and that it's not true. He has stated across multiple discussions that everyone thinks things they wouldn't actually do, and attempts to tie this into unwanted intrusive thoughts.
So the way I see it is that part of you does want to do it, and that doesn't really mean much about you as a person. Like when you're thinking about pushing an old lady in front of the train at the subway, part of you wants to do it. Like maybe finding kids cute or attractive somehow is part of what makes us want to keep them alive and protect them and sacrifice so much for them. And maybe there's no way to evolutionarily completely disentangle that from sexual attraction.
The main takeaway, I would say, is that I need Mr. Girl to acknowledge a few things. First of all, it's that some fantasies are bad, because they are predictors for actually indulging in said fantasies. And second, that unwanted intrusive thoughts are fine and normal. People experience these thoughts without desiring to, and they have no implication in the real world. And there is a very clear and major difference between this and a fantasy. I'd also like Mr. Girl to acknowledge that he will not conflate the two. An undesirable intrusive thought is not the same experience as a daydream-like scenario that a fantasy describes. And unwanted intrusive thoughts are not thoughts you should indulge in any way whatsoever, positive or negative, in order to help your brain remove them completely. When Mr. Girl has his Cuties review, where he speaks about underage girls touching their crotches and says he needs to go back and watch it again and again and again in a seemingly enjoyable way, this is implying that he has a daydream-like positive fantasy about these girls, which, according to his own logic, is a predictor for actually indulging in said fantasies. And now, as for Bowblax.
It's like people's brains are being warped about what reality is. Where you see Bowblax saying things like, well, ever since I was 25, an 18-year-old is like a child to me. I'm like, I cannot believe you. I don't believe you. I don't believe that. I think you might think that, but it's not true. It's not true.
You
that
think
is
he
what
believes that because it sounds good or because...
I don't know. I don't want to speak to his his conscious thought process, but it is very convenient that your sexuality happens to line up exactly with what YouTube would want you to say your sexuality is. That's a little too neat and pretty there. And so I'm trying to set this tone of no, you can't fucking define what gives me a boner. No, you don't get to decide that for me. My sexuality is not defined by an orientation label or ad-friendly guidelines or anything. It's defined by who I am and what I experience day to day. It's a complex thing with all kinds of dark nooks and crannies that if it's within TOS to explore, we're going to explore them.
I think it's fair to say that I don't believe Mr. Girl and that he thinks fantasies and unwanted intrusive thoughts are on the same playing field. He might think that, but it's not true. It's a little too convenient for him. As someone who defines what gives him a boner, 11-year-olds and kids twerking as part of his sexuality, and attempts to conflate this with random unwanted intrusive thoughts that an average person might experience. Just as Mr. Girl attempts to draw a conclusion between people who criticize him and a higher desire such as money, why can't I draw the same conclusion that he makes these conflated arguments because he has some other higher desire himself? What could that be? Who knows? Maybe it's normalizing this sexuality. And that's what it seems to come out as, especially recently due to these last few discussions. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. I'm pretty sure I've poked the holes in exactly where Mr. Girl's logic is, because a lot of people have a gross, visceral reaction to Mr. Girl's arguments, but they don't know exactly why. And I'm pretty sure that this video does a good job explaining that. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, leave a like on the video, and subscribe. Thank you guys for watching.